In the years following his greatest defeat, William Wallace ceased to be a man and became a ghost. He was a phantom haunting the highlands and forests of Scotland, a whisper on the wind. To the English who occupied his country, he was a terrifying bogeyman. To the common people of Scotland, he was a slumbering hero, waiting for his moment to return. But to the King of England, Edward I, he was an obsession. A massive price was placed on Wallace's head. A fortune in gold and land that could turn a poor man into a lord, and a lord into a king's favorite. Every sheriff, every bailiff, every bounty hunter and nobleman in the kingdom was on the hunt for him. William Wallace, the former guardian of Scotland, was now the most wanted man in the British Isles. It had not always been so. Just a few years earlier, he was the undisputed champion of Scottish independence, a commoner with no noble blood. He had risen from obscurity to lead a successful rebellion against the English occupation. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, his small, disciplined army achieved an impossible victory, shattering the pride of the English forces. For a brief, glorious moment, he was the master of Scotland, a hero who had proven that the mighty English war machine could be broken. But that glory was fleeting. In 1298, at the Battle of Falkirk, Wallace's army of spearmen met the full, vengeful force of King Edward's army. The battle was a disaster. The Scottish nobility, jealous of the commoner's power and wary of his tactics, abandoned him on the field, their cavalry deserting as the battle began. Wallace's infantry was left to be mercilessly cut down by a storm of English longbow arrows. The defeat at Falkirk was absolute. Wallace's army was shattered, his reputation was damaged, and he was forced to resign the prestigious title of Guardian of Scotland. He had been abandoned by the very nobles he had fought to empower. He now found himself a man with enemies on all sides. From the south, a vengeful English king, with all the resources of a kingdom at his command, hunted him relentlessly, and from within, the treacherous and shifting loyalties of the Scottish aristocracy meant that any friend could become a foe. How could a man survive for 7 long years as a fugitive under these conditions? And after all the battles and bloodshed, who would be the one to finally deliver the Lion of Scotland to his cage? The answer would not be found on a battlefield, but in the dark shadows of divided loyalties, political envy, and cold, hard cash. After the disaster at Falkirk, William Wallace did not flee Scotland. He faded into it, stripped of his title as Guardian and no longer able to command a great army. He returned to the kind of war he knew best. He became a guerrilla fighter once more, a phantom leading small, dedicated bands of men in the forests of Selkirk and Ettrick. They lived off the land, melting into the hills and woods, emerging only to launch swift, brutal, and unexpected attacks. They ambushed English supply convoys, raided isolated garrisons, and assassinated key officials. For the English occupiers, Wallace was a constant, terrifying menace for the Scottish people. He was a living symbol that the spirit of rebellion had not been completely crushed. He could no longer win a pitched battle, so he waged a war of 1,000 cuts, bleeding the English presence in his homeland, and reminding them that their conquest was not yet complete. But Wallace knew that raids and ambushes alone would not free his country. Scotland needed international recognition, and powerful allies. In late 1299, he embarked on a dangerous diplomatic mission. He sailed to France to plead his case before King Philip IV as an enemy of England. Philip received Wallace with honor and even provided him with a letter of safe passage to travel to Rome to petition the Pope. For a time, it seemed that diplomacy might succeed where warfare had failed. The Pope even issued a bull ordering Edward to release Scottish bishops and to cease his attacks. But these were hollow victories. The great powers of Europe were playing their own games. France was not willing to commit to a full-scale war with England over Scotland, and the Pope's influence over the powerful English king was limited. After years of frustrating and fruitless diplomacy, Wallace realized the truth. Scotland's salvation would not come from Paris or Rome. It would have to be won on Scottish soil. He returned to his homeland around 1303 to continue the fight from the shadows. While Wallace was fighting his desperate war, his nemesis, King Edward I, was methodically tightening the noose. Edward, known as Longshanks, was a brilliant administrator and a ruthless military commander. He was a king accustomed to absolute obedience, and Wallace's continued defiance was a personal, infuriating insult. The capture of this one commoner became a royal obsession. Edward poured immense resources into the manhunt. He established a vast network of spies and paid informers, their eyes and ears present in every town and castle in Scotland. He offered a colossal bounty for Wallace's headism so large it could tempt the most loyal of allies. He systematically hunted down Wallace's known supporters, torturing them for information about his whereabouts. The entire machinery of the English state was focused on one singular goal: the capture of William Wallace. For 7 years, the Lion of Scotland had outsmarted, outfought, and outrun the most powerful king in Europe. But now, with his return to a Scotland that was increasingly under English control, he was running out of places to hide. The net was closing. By 1304, the landscape of the Scottish resistance had changed. After nearly a decade of brutal warfare, King Edward's conquest was all but complete. Most of the great Scottish nobles, seeing the futility of further resistance, had surrendered. In a series of formal ceremonies, they put their names to the so-called Ragman rolls, swearing new oaths of fealty to the English king in order to keep their lands, their titles, and their lives. Even men who would later become heroes of Scottish independence, like Robert the Bruce, had, at various times, submitted to English rule. It was an age of brutal pragmatism. For these men, survival meant compromise. But for William Wallace, there was no compromise. His unwavering, absolute resistance to English rule now made him an inconvenient and dangerous figure, not just to the English, but to the Scottish nobles who had chosen to bend the knee. In this new world of divided loyalties, Wallace's black and white patriotism had no place. The man who would ultimately bring Wallace down was a product of this complicated world. Sir John Menteith was not a simple, greedy villain. He was a powerful and respected Scottish nobleman, a man who had himself fought for Scottish independence in the earlier stages of the war. He was a peer of the realm, a man who understood the complex dance of power and survival. Like so many others, Menteith had eventually submitted to King Edward, pledging his loyalty to the English crown. In return for his fealty, Edward rewarded him handsomely. He was made the Sheriff of Dumbarton, a position that gave him control over one of the most powerful and strategic castles in all of Scotland. This placed Menteith in a uniquely treacherous position. He was a Scot, a man who could command the trust and confidence of his countrymen. But he was also a sworn agent of the English king. His power and position dependent on his service to the very regime Wallace sought to destroy. He was the perfect man to hunt a Scottish hero. With his network of contacts and his intimate knowledge of the country, Menteith began to systematically dismantle what was left of Wallace's support system. The net that had been closing for 7 years now began to tighten with terrifying speed. Menteith's agents moved through the country, gathering intelligence, offering bribes, and making threats. Key allies who had provided Wallace with food and shelter were identified, arrested, and in some cases, executed. His lines of communication were cut. His safe houses were compromised. For Wallace, the world was shrinking. The web of loyal friends and patriots that had sustained him in the shadows for so long was being torn apart. Thread by thread, he was becoming increasingly isolated, forced to rely on a smaller and smaller circle of trusted companions. He was a lion being driven into an ever smaller cage, unaware that the man closing the door was not an English soldier, but one of his own kind. On the night of August 5th, 1305, after 7 years in the shadows, the hunt for William Wallace came to an end. He was near Glasgow, in a small farmhouse at a place called Robroyston. He was traveling with his two most trusted remaining companions, a man named Curly and his young ward. Wallace believed he was there for a secret meeting, a rendezvous with men loyal to Robert the Bruce to discuss the future of the resistance. For the first time in a long time, he may have allowed himself a moment of security, a brief respite in a house he believed to be safe, among people he believed to be friends. It was a fatal mistake. The location had been betrayed to the English. The trap was sprung in the dead of night. A large force of armed men, loyal to the Sheriff of Dumbarton, Sir John Menteith, had secretly surrounded the house. They burst in while Wallace and his men were asleep. The scene exploded into chaos. Curly was cut down almost immediately. Wallace, a giant of a man and a fearsome warrior, fought back desperately. He killed 2 of the soldiers, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. He was subdued, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of numbers, and finally bound in iron chains. As he was dragged from the house, bloody and defeated, Wallace would have seen the man commanding the operation. It was not an English knight. It was not a foreign enemy. It was Sir John Menteith, a Scottish nobleman, a man he knew, who now stood watching as the Lion of Scotland was put in chains. The betrayal was complete. After 7 years of eluding the English, Wallace had been captured without a fight, handed over by one of his own countrymen. The act of betrayal was treated as a simple business transaction by the English crown. King Edward I was overjoyed to finally have his nemesis in his clutches, and he was generous to those who had delivered him. Sir John Menteith, for his service, was rewarded with a vast grant of valuable land, £100 worth, a significant fortune that solidified his power and influence. the lesser men who assisted in the capture, including the servant who had first betrayed Wallace's location to Menteith, were paid in cash for their part in the affair. The price for Scotland's greatest hero had been a few acres of land and a bag of silver. The hunt was over. William Wallace was now a captive, his fate sealed. All that remained was the long, humiliating journey south, to face the vengeance of a king who had spent years dreaming of this very moment. With William Wallace in chains, his captors began the long journey south. For 22 days, he was marched over for 100 miles from Dumbarton to London. This was not a swift, secret transfer. It was a calculated public spectacle, a victory tour for King Edward. Wallace was paraded through the English countryside and towns like a prized beast, a trophy from the savage north. Crowds gathered to stare at the legendary Scottish rebel, the bogeyman who had haunted their kingdom, now brought low and bound in irons. For Edward, this procession was the first part of Wallace's punishment. It was a ritual of humiliation, designed to strip away the myth and show the world that their great hero was just a mortal man, a defeated and powerless criminal at the mercy of his king. Back in Scotland, the news of his capture by Sir John Menteith sent a shockwave of shame and anger through the land. Menteith received his lands and his silver from a grateful English king. But in the eyes of his own people, his name would be forever cursed. For centuries to come, the name Menteith would be a byword for traitor in Scotland, a permanent stain on the national honor. But the betrayal had another, more profound consequence. It served as a brutal lesson for the man who would become Scotland's savior, Robert the Bruce. Bruce, who had spent years navigating the treacherous world of Anglo-Scottish politics, saw in Wallace's fate the ultimate result of the nobility's division and infighting. He learned that to free Scotland, a leader needed more than just Wallace's passion. He needed the political cunning to unite the feuding clans, and the ruthlessness to eliminate any internal threat. The betrayal of William Wallace helped forge the iron will of the man who would one day finish what he had started. Finally, the grim procession reached London. Wallace was met by massive, jeering crowds and formally handed over to the Lord Mayor. He was marched through the city streets and imprisoned in the Tower of London to await his inevitable fate. The 7-year hunt was over. The ghost of the Scottish forests had been caught. He was no longer a general, a diplomat, or a guerrilla fighter. He was simply a body in a cell, a condemned man delivered into the hands of a king who had spent years meticulously planning a spectacular and horrific revenge. The betrayal was complete. Now, the butcher's work could begin. So, how should history judge the man who gave up the lion? Was Sir John Menteith a pragmatic nobleman making a hard choice to secure peace? Or a simple traitor who sold his nation's hero for land and silver? Share your verdict in the comments below. And to judge for yourself more of history's most controversial figures, make sure you subscribe to the Black Chronicle.